things do look dire looking at the visuals, but we might have some help on the way. But before we get into it, let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into New York State and voting. We got some slides here. Divided we stand. First up, I can show you voting reform. Now, this is a chart of voter participation in April of 2016 during primary season. 32% of Brooklyn's 5.2 million registered Democrats showed up and did their duty. If we go down to the Republicans, who are only about 2.5 million in the state, 31% of them showed up. And we get that dubious distinction again, and we're going to reiterate, New York State represents lots of folks in the nation, but we only rank 46th in terms of voter turnout. There's only 50 states. We definitely got to do better, people. We're going to go on to this next slide and look at voting reform. Now, we've already seen the bad results, so these are some proposals before the New York State legislature designed to improve access to votes and hopefully bump us at least out of the 40s. They include proposing early voting, no excuse absentee voting, no letter from your doctor, you just can do it, automatic voter registration at age of 18, also online voting registration, and as long as you're doing it, you might as well be able to vote by mail, have open primaries that don't restrict you to party, same-day voter registration, also looking at extending deadlines for registration. Now, none of these are out of the realm of possibility. There are lots of states doing a number of these things, some even doing all of them. So we're going to take a little bit of a look at some reform in the A block about what we can do in New York to get us on track. In the A block.
Tomorrow, most of us will be carrying out our civic duty and putting an end to the long election cycle. But for many in New York State, it's difficult to actually make it to the polls and fulfill that duty. Strict voter registration laws are the first barriers to entry. If you make it past that hurdle, you are then typically confined to 15 hours on a single day to pull the lever. Not so easy if you work long hours, have a long commute, have child care issues. The list goes on.
Well, here to tell us about ways we can improve voter access and get more voters to the polls are New York State Assembly member Latrice Walker. Welcome to BK Live.
Thank you for having me back.
And the founder and creator of Take Tuesdays. They're a campaign to get corporations to designate Election Day as a paid work holiday. An idea whose time has come, Noah. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Thank you for being here. Latrice, the State Assembly just passed a major overhaul of the election process. Can you tell us about some of the changes that we might see as a result of that?
Well, we passed a number of changes in the New York State Assembly. But of course, we represent a two-house legislature, so we do still have to do a number of items in order to move these pieces of legislation in the New York State Senate, ultimately to be signed into law by the governor. But we have passed early voting pieces of legislation, the same-day voter registration, no excuse absentee ballot. I've also introduced a New York State Voting Rights Act, where for communities that have been largely discriminated against, we lost protections under the Federal Voting Rights Act, and now we have a Voting Rights Act here in New York State, hopefully, if we can get it through the New York State Senate again as well. So we have a long road ahead of us. Though we are keeping our eyes on the prize, we know that in Brooklyn we had about 100,000 people that were purged off the voting rolls, and we're expecting to do a number of things to prevent that from happening as well. So I'm excited about the upcoming election, but more so about our next session where we're going to push through some very valuable pieces of legislation.
So Noah, we've got someone working on the inside, pulling the levers of government, and you're starting a populist campaign to get employers and corporations to do the right thing.
Yeah, exactly. So love what you're doing. Love that that's happening. The political process, when we recognized that it was taking a little longer than we would hope, and ahead of the 2016 election, it didn't seem like there was going to be any changes to make it a national holiday or maybe move it to a weekend. We decided to just ask companies themselves to give the day off, for at least a significant portion of the day off. And a lot of companies have been really receptive to that when they recognize they have the power to increase civic engagement among their employees. And it's been going really well.
So when you say ask companies, I mean, how do you approach companies and like where do you start with that?
So initially, it was really just sort of cold calling and pitching them over email, explaining to them the research that's come out. There's been a lot of research about how a lot of this stuff disproportionately affects minority and low-income populations. How 35% of people who don't vote because they cite problems with conflicts with work or school. And so when they see that that's really a driving force behind people not being able to get out to the polls, they realize that they have a real impact. They can have a real impact, and they usually are very receptive.
So I want to go back to the primaries for a second. This April, we saw all those people in Brooklyn who fell off of the rolls. Some of them showed up to places they've been voting for years and decades in some cases and said, oh no, you can't vote here. This isn't happening. So how much did that help to really push the action in your house of the New York State Legislature?
Well, by the time those issues have come to the fore, the New York State Assembly was always a very progressive house. And a number of those measures make it through each and every year. But it did make the issue in vogue, and it got the attention of our comptroller, of our mayor, the governor, even in his State of the State, had allowed for his version of automatic voter registration, utilizing DMV as a resource.
Voter thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you show up at a motor vehicle, they have the authority to ask you, are you interested in registering to vote? And if you say yes, you are automatically registered. We call that automated voter registration, where you have to ask and affirmatively say no if you're not interested, as opposed to just automatically being included on the voter roll. I also wanted to mention, in support of NOAA's efforts, in the New York State Modernized Voter Registration Act, we do allow for 6 days paid leave for individuals who work for the state and the city who are interested in working on Election Day. And we know that sometimes part of the issue that we see on Election Day is just people who are just not equipped to handle the type of equipment and new electronic poll books. So I look forward to having that, come to fruition one day as well.
No, at what point do you consider what you're doing to be an overall success? Is it the number of companies you get involved? Is it a percentage of voter turnout? What is it?
So for us, it's really it's twofold. It's showing, one, that a lot of influential companies and big companies and small companies are capable of giving the time off. And I think showing that that's a possibility, showing that they want to do that voluntarily, will hopefully help efforts like Latrice's and others to make it so that we can push legislation through to make it easy for people to vote. And showing that companies are on board with that is really important. The second thing is the more obvious one, which is ahead of this election, we want to try to get as many people out to the polls, make it easy for them, and show them that their employers are okay with it. There's hundreds of thousands of employees now that are going to be able to go to the polls and have extra time off. And we're really excited about that. We definitely care about the employee numbers. We also are very aware of how much of an important issue this is for hourly workers. And so we've really been trying to make an effort to try to reach hourly workers as well as salaried workers.
So I just wanted to bring attention, we just showed a video a second ago of a line at North Carolina State University where people were trying to get in their last early voting days before the thing is up. So I wanted to ask you about these plans and making sure they're implemented fairly and that the resources are there across the state to get into the district so it's even. So even if we do get voter voting, if we get early voting, you saw people waiting in line for hours and hours, that the resources are there. So is that part going to be ready as well?
Well, that's also included in the legislation. So we are also advocating for more locations or poll site locations where people will be allowed to cast their ballot early. Of course, we are hitting a lot of ambivalence toward doing that because this is going to cost too much money for many of our Board of Elections locations throughout the state of New York. Yeah. A lot of time we look just at New York City, right. But of course we have some upstate counties that we have to take into consideration as well. But we've seen across the country that this works, that the cost-saving measures are effective. And, it wasn't the end of the world. So early voting is definitely possible. I think if we put our money where our mouth is and make sure that the resources are behind it to see that it's effective and efficient, then we won't see the type of lines that we're exhibiting in North Carolina.
So is there resistance?
There's a lot of resistance. There's a lot of resistance. But, one of the things that I always say is we're asking people who have a real stake in outcomes of elections to control elections.
Yeah.
And if there's a fear behind, allowing folks to go out and vote early, and,
Yeah.
and maybe someone from a different party will, will take control of it.
So who's mad? Who's mad about all of these
Republicans are
reforms?
upset over this. What do this is, it's always something that we're taking a lead on in a Democratic House in the New York State New York State Assembly.
Yeah.
And hopefully if the Democrats can take control of the New York State Senate again tomorrow, then a lot of these measures, we're looking up. We're all the way up, as they say.
So are we talking local, primary, statewide? Like, how do you want to roll it out?
It's definitely statewide. We have to, more resources, of course, will have to go to more populated counties, but it definitely will be required to be a New York State wide effort. So.
And Noah, same question. Are you proposing this for national and local and primaries?
Yeah, so right now, so this was started 6 months ago ahead of this election. This is very recent, but we have thought about going, to elections in the future and are hoping we think this is an important issue, in every election.
Can we drill down a little? I know we already named the Republicans as some of the enemies of reform here, but to go back to the Voting Rights Act that was just kicked to the curb by the Supreme Court, you specifically had plans that were left out of a lot of the larger patchwork that's been hobbled together. So give us your pitch for why we should bring those things back in to protect those specific classes who've been historically discriminated against at election time.
Absolutely, and thank you for that. So just the other day, there was a young man who came into my office who wanted to register to vote. Mm-hmm. He didn't have a DMV ID and thought that he didn't need his ID in order to register. Well, come to find out you don't, but there's a piece on the voter registration that requires either your motor vehicle ID number or your Social Security number. He knew neither one. You cannot know either one, but when you show up to vote on election day, you have to have some form of identification to say who you are. So guess what? New York State has voter ID laws as well. Mm-hmm. And we know that voter ID laws have been the tool of discrimination and disenfranchisement across our nation. And we have to release those barriers. A few months ago, or actually a few years ago, right after Hurricane Sandy, people were told you can show up and vote wherever it is that you want. Right. If we still had the protection of the New York State Voting Rights Act, any changes to our voting would have to be approved by the Department of Justice. So my bill requires that the New York State Attorney General's office to do any pre-approvals, any pre-clearances on any changes to our laws that would disproportionately affect people who have formerly notoriously been disenfranchised in the voter process. So I look forward to pushing that piece of legislation along this year for it to pass. Now, one thing I do recognize is our voting rights may have taken us over 200 years to achieve, but it will take us a lifetime to protect, and I'm a big defender.
And this is something A.G. Schneiderman is behind as
yes.
well.
Mm-hmm.
And he's had this voter line since, 2012, sort of an in-run around the Board of Elections. If you have any irregularities or whatever, you can call him.
You can definitely reach out to the New York State Attorney General's office. But of course, the Board of Elections is a place where you can lodge a lot of your complaints. There are a number of good government groups.
Off the rolls too.
Yeah, but you know what? There's some really good people in the Board of Elections.
Sure.
There, particularly Commissioner John Flatteau, who has definitely been someone who's been on the ground for many, 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 many years, and we have full confidence in his abilities to carry out and make sure that the Voting Rights Act is true today as it was in 1965.
So finally, Noah, where do you think we end up? What's your hope for the future with all this? We saw the slides. We're number 46 out of 50.
How can we help you get the day off?
Yeah, well, not only are you 46 out of 50, but the country as a whole is 138th out of 172.
Right. And we've been talking about this election for 18 months. People are very passionate with one side or the other. How do we get that registration up when it's still going to be so low?
So first off, I love what you're doing. I think what you're doing is fantastic. I'm looking forward to more stuff like that happening. I think, I do think that voting on a work day is a real problem. We only do it because of a law passed in 1845, and we decided we wanted to vote on a Tuesday because it didn't interfere with the biblical Sabbath, and it took a day to get into town.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
So we've stuck with voting on a Tuesday, this tradition of voting on a Tuesday, but we've forgotten about the sentiment, which is that we were picking a day that worked for the most number of people in our country.
Yeah.
And granted, there were a lot of problems with voting at that time. There were a lot of people that couldn't vote. Women couldn't vote at that time. But they got that one thing right. And I think we should be thinking about making that either a national holiday in the future or moving it to a weekend. Anything we can do to make it easier for people to vote, we should be doing.
Well, thank you both very much for being here and for the work that you do.
Thank you.
If anyone was not going to vote, hopefully they saw this segment and going to get out and vote. And thank you for the work that you do in improving those numbers. Thank you.